Welcome back to Sleeptime Historian. Tonight, we journey into one of the darkest and most terrifying periods in human history. Imagine waking up in a medieval town where rumors of a mysterious sickness drift through the streets. At first, the stories seem distant, coming from faraway lands along busy trade routes. But soon the rumors become reality. Neighbors begin to disappear. Church bells ring more often. Markets grow quieter. Fear spreads faster than the disease itself. This was the world of the Black Death, a pandemic that changed the course of history and claimed the lives of millions across Europe, Asia, and beyond. In tonight's story, we will explore the world before the plague arrived, follow its deadly journey across continents, witness the panic and confusion of ordinary people, and discover how doctors, priests, merchants, peasants, and rulers struggled to survive one of humanity's greatest disasters. We will walk through silent villages, crowded medieval cities, plague-filled streets, and forgotten graveyards as we uncover what life was truly like during the age of the Black Death. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift back to the 14th century, where uncertainty filled the air and every sunrise brought new questions. As our journey begins, ask yourself one simple question. If you had lived in medieval Europe during the Black Death, would you have survived? Long before the Black Death arrived, medieval Europe was already a difficult place to live. Life was hard, food was never guaranteed, and most people spent their days working from sunrise to sunset simply to survive. The vast majority of the population lived in small villages surrounded by fields, forests, and dirt roads. A typical peasant would rarely travel more than a few miles from the place where he was born. News moved slowly, and the wider world felt distant and mysterious. Yet despite these hardships, life continued much as it had for generations. Markets bustled with activity, churches filled with worshippers, and merchants carried goods between towns and cities. Children played in muddy streets, farmers worked their land, and families gathered around fires at the end of long days. Few people could imagine that one of the greatest disasters in human history was already moving silently toward them. Far beyond Europe, along the trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, something deadly was beginning to spread. At first, nobody in Europe knew of its existence. There were no newspapers, no radio broadcasts, and no warning systems. The disease traveled unnoticed, hidden among merchants, sailors, cargo, and rats. While ordinary people focused on their daily lives, the Black Death was drawing closer with every passing month. The world seemed normal. The future seemed predictable. Yet beneath that sense of normality, history was preparing to change forever. In the early 1300s, Europe was more connected than many people realize. Trade routes stretched across continents, linking distant kingdoms through a vast network of merchants and travelers. Ships crossed seas carrying silk, spices, grain, and precious goods from lands most Europeans would never see. These routes brought wealth and opportunity, but they also carried dangers that nobody fully understood. Somewhere far to the east, outbreaks of a deadly disease had already begun devastating communities. As traders moved from city to city, the plague traveled with them, crossed mountains, deserts, rivers, and oceans. Slowly but relentlessly, it moved westward. Nobody knew what was coming. Nobody could stop it. In towns and villages across Europe, people continued living their ordinary lives. Bakers prepared bread before dawn. Blacksmiths hammered metal in noisy workshops. Monks copied books in quiet monasteries. Fishermen set sail before sunrise. Life felt familiar and secure. Yet strange rumors occasionally arrived with travelers. Stories spoke of entire communities falling ill. Some claimed thousands had died. Others described mysterious symptoms and sudden deaths. Most people dismissed these tales as exaggerations. Medieval travelers were known for telling dramatic stories. Surely things could not be as bad as they sounded. Unfortunately, they were. As the years passed, the invisible threat moved closer to Europe's shores. Ships continued arriving in busy ports. Merchants continued unloading cargo. The wheels of trade continued turning. And hidden among them traveled a disease that would soon bring fear, suffering, and death on a scale few people could even imagine. The calm before the storm was nearing its end. The Black Death did not appear in Europe overnight. Its journey began thousands of miles away, far beyond the knowledge of most medieval Europeans. In the distant regions of Asia, trade routes connected countless cities, villages, and empires. Merchants traveled these roads carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic goods. The routes brought prosperity to many places, but they also created pathways for something far more dangerous. Hidden among cargo and supplies, rats traveled alongside humans. Living on ships, wagons, and in crowded settlements, they moved wherever trade moved. Along with these rats came fleas carrying a deadly bacterium that nobody at the time could understand. There were no microscopes, no knowledge of germs, no understanding of how diseases spread. People could only observe the terrifying results. As traders continued their journeys, the plague advanced with them, crossed mountains, deserts, and seas. Entire communities encountered the disease for the first time, only to watch helplessly as it spread among their families and neighbors. In many places, death arrived so quickly that people barely had time to react. Travelers carried stories of suffering wherever they went. Tales of abandoned villages, overflowing graveyards, and entire households dying within days began circulating across the known world. Yet to many Europeans, these stories still seemed distant. The horrors were happening somewhere else, somewhere far away. The average farmer in France, England, or Germany had no reason to believe those distant tragedies would soon become his own reality. While ordinary life continued, the plague moved steadily westward, following the same routes that had connected civilizations for centuries. Every ship that entered a harbor, every caravan that crossed a border, and every merchant who arrived in a new city unknowingly helped bring the disease closer to Europe. The continent remained unaware that one of the deadliest events in human history was already approaching its shores. By the late 1340s, the Black Death had reached the edges of Europe. The first signs appeared in busy trading ports where ships arrived from distant lands. These ports were the beating hearts of medieval commerce. Merchants negotiated deals, sailors unloaded cargo, and people from many cultures mixed together in crowded streets. They were places of opportunity and wealth. They also became the perfect entry points for the plague. One of the most famous stories comes from the Mediterranean, where ships arrived carrying not only valuable goods but also sickness and death. According to historical accounts, some vessels entered port with crews already dying. Others arrived with sailors so weak they could barely stand. The disease spread quickly among those who came into contact with them. At first, nobody understood what was happening. People saw the symptoms but had no explanation for them. Healthy individuals suddenly developed fever, weakness, and painful swellings. Within days, many were dead. Fear began spreading almost as quickly as the disease itself. Rumors filled the streets. Some blamed poisoned water. Others blamed bad air. Some believed it was a punishment from God. Without scientific knowledge, people searched desperately for answers wherever they could find them. As news traveled inland, anxiety grew. Communities heard reports of entire neighborhoods falling ill. Merchants brought stories of cities overwhelmed by death. Church bells rang constantly for funerals. Yet even then, many hoped the disease would stop before reaching them. They believed distance might protect them. They believed luck might spare them. Unfortunately, the plague respected neither hope nor distance. Trade routes connected nearly every corner of Europe, and the disease followed those routes relentlessly. Town after town began reporting outbreaks. Villages watched travelers with suspicion. Families prayed for protection. Still, the sickness advanced. What had once seemed like distant rumors was now becoming a terrifying reality. The Black Death had arrived at Europe's gates, and soon millions of people would find themselves living through a nightmare unlike anything their world had ever experienced. At first, the arrival of the Black Death did not seem like the beginning of a catastrophe. It seemed like another sickness among many. Medieval people were familiar with disease. Fevers, infections, and sudden deaths were unfortunate but common parts of life. When the first victims became ill, most communities saw no reason to panic. A merchant developed a fever. A sailor collapsed after arriving at port. A farmer complained of weakness and chills. Such things happened all the time. Yet this illness behaved differently. The sick grew worse with terrifying speed. Within days, painful swellings appeared beneath their arms, around their necks, and near their groins. Their fevers became intense. Their bodies weakened. Some became delirious, speaking nonsense or crying out in confusion. Families watched helplessly as loved ones deteriorated before their eyes. What frightened people most was how quickly healthy individuals became victims. A person could appear normal one day and be dead a few days later. The familiar rhythms of life began to change. Conversations in markets grew quieter. Neighbors exchanged worried glances. Rumors spread from house to house. Nobody understood the cause. Some blamed bad air drifting through the streets. Others believed poisonous vapors rose from the earth. Many saw the disease as a punishment from God. Priests prayed for answers while healers desperately searched for remedies. Nothing seemed to work. As the number of deaths increased, fear spread throughout entire communities. People began avoiding those who appeared sick. Travelers were viewed with suspicion. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Yet despite every effort, the disease continued to advance. The first victims had appeared, and with them came the realization that something far more dangerous than an ordinary illness had arrived. Once the Black Death entered a town, fear often spread faster than the disease itself. People could not see the cause of the plague, but they could see its effects. Every day brought new funerals. Church bells rang constantly. Streets that had once been full of life became quieter with each passing week. Shopkeepers worried about customers. Farmers worried about harvests. Parents worried about their children. Nobody knew who might become sick next. The uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying part. A person could do everything they believed was right and still fall ill. Entire households became infected. Friends stopped visiting one another. In some places, neighbors avoided even speaking face to face. Fear transformed ordinary behavior. People who had lived side by side for years suddenly viewed each other as potential sources of danger. Some fled cities in search of safety in the countryside. Others remained, hoping the outbreak would pass. Wealthy families often escaped first, leaving crowded urban centers behind. Yet many discovered that distance offered no guarantee of protection. The disease followed roads, rivers, and trade routes wherever people traveled. As deaths continued to rise, stories became increasingly horrifying. Travelers described abandoned homes. Priests spoke of graveyards filling faster than they could be expanded. Entire families disappeared within days. Some towns lost so many residents that daily life nearly stopped functioning. The Black Death was no longer a distant rumor. It was no longer a problem affecting someone else. It had become a terrifying reality. Across Europe, millions of people began to understand that they were living through something unprecedented. The world they had always known was changing before their eyes, and nobody could say when or if the nightmare would end. As the Black Death continued its march across Europe, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. What had begun as isolated outbreaks soon transformed into a continent-wide catastrophe. In city after city, the same terrifying pattern repeated itself. The first cases appeared quietly, then the number of sick began to grow. Within weeks, hospitals filled beyond capacity, churches overflowed with mourners, and graveyards struggled to accommodate the dead. Medieval cities were especially vulnerable. Narrow streets, crowded homes, poor sanitation, and large populations created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Families often lived together in small spaces. Merchants, laborers, craftsmen, and travelers constantly moved through busy markets and public squares. Once the plague entered such an environment, it moved with frightening speed. Entire neighborhoods fell ill. Some streets became eerily silent as residents either died or fled. Those who remained often lived in constant fear. Every cough, every fever, every unusual symptom became a source of anxiety. Parents watched their children closely. Husbands feared for their wives. Friends feared for one another. Yet fear itself could not stop the disease. Day after day, the death toll climbed higher. In some places, so many people died that normal life nearly ceased to function. Shops closed, markets emptied, construction projects stopped, fields went unharvested. There simply were not enough healthy people left to maintain ordinary routines. Even those responsible for caring for the sick sometimes became victims themselves. Doctors fell ill, priests fell ill, caregivers fell ill. The very people communities relied upon for help were often among the first to suffer. For many medieval Europeans, it felt as though the entire world was unraveling. The familiar structures of daily life were collapsing, replaced by uncertainty and grief. No one knew how long the nightmare would last. No one knew whether their town would survive. And with every passing day, the growing number of funerals served as a painful reminder that the plague showed no sign of stopping. As the weeks turned into months, many communities across Europe found themselves surrounded by death in a way they had never experienced before. Funeral processions became a common sight. Church bells rang so often that some people claimed they could hear them even in their sleep. The sound became part of daily life, a constant reminder that someone else had been lost. In many towns, graveyards filled faster than new graves could be dug. Workers struggled to keep up with the growing number of bodies. Families who once gathered to mourn loved ones properly often found themselves unable to perform traditional funeral rites. There were simply too many dead. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed nearly every institution that existed. Churches, hospitals, and local governments all faced challenges beyond anything they had encountered before. Some priests spent their days moving from one dying person to another, offering prayers and comfort wherever they could. Others became victims themselves, reducing the number of people available to help. Fear and grief touched every level of society. Rich and poor suffered alike. Noble families watched relatives fall ill. Peasants buried neighbors and friends. Merchants who had spent years building successful businesses suddenly found themselves alone. The plague cared little for wealth, status, or power. This was one reason it seemed so terrifying. Many medieval people believed that social position provided some degree of protection from life's hardships. The Black Death shattered that belief. Everyone appeared vulnerable. Entire households vanished within days. Some homes stood abandoned, their doors closed and their windows dark. In certain cities, travelers described streets that felt strangely empty. The usual sounds of commerce and conversation were replaced by silence. Yet amid the tragedy, people continued searching for hope. Families prayed together. Communities attempted to care for the sick. Some individuals risked their own lives helping neighbors despite the danger. Acts of kindness continued to exist even in the darkest moments. Still, the reality remained impossible to escape. Europe was experiencing one of the deadliest disasters in human history. Millions had already died, and millions more would follow. The world people had known before the plague seemed increasingly distant, almost like a memory from another lifetime. For many survivors, life would never feel the same again. The Black Death was not only taking lives, it was transforming society itself, leaving deep scars that would remain long after the disease finally began to fade. As the Black Death spread across Europe, people desperately searched for answers. They wanted to know what was causing the disease, how it spread, and most importantly, how it could be stopped. Unfortunately, medieval medicine was not prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. Doctors lived in a world without microscopes, without modern biology, and without any understanding of bacteria. They could observe symptoms, but they could not see the true enemy. To them, the plague seemed mysterious, unpredictable, and almost supernatural. When patients arrived suffering from high fevers, painful swellings, weakness, and confusion, doctors relied on the medical theories of their time. Many believed illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids known as humors. Others thought poisonous air, known as miasma, drifted through towns and infected anyone who breathed it. Some argued that unusual planetary alignments had corrupted the atmosphere. Others believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. With no clear explanation available, treatments varied widely. Doctors prescribed herbs, special diets, bloodletting, and strange mixtures of ingredients that they hoped would restore health. Patients were encouraged to avoid certain foods, carry fragrant flowers, or burn aromatic substances in their homes to cleanse the air. Wealthy individuals often paid large sums for remedies that promised protection. Yet despite these efforts, the plague continued claiming lives. Every failed treatment increased fear and uncertainty. Communities watched respected physicians struggle to save patients. Some doctors remained dedicated, moving from house to house despite knowing they could become infected themselves. Others fled affected areas, fearing for their own survival. The situation created a painful reality. People looked to medicine for solutions, but medicine had few answers. The disease seemed unstoppable. Families gathered around sick loved ones hoping for a miracle. Doctors worked tirelessly using the knowledge available to them. Yet day after day, the number of deaths continued to rise. For many Europeans, it felt as though humanity was fighting an invisible enemy it could neither understand nor defeat. As fear spread across Europe, desperate people became willing to try almost anything that promised protection from the Black Death. Rumors circulated constantly. One traveler claimed a certain herb could prevent infection. Another insisted a special drink had saved an entire family. Markets filled with remedies, charms, and treatments sold by individuals eager to profit from the crisis. Some people carried bags filled with fragrant plants, believing strong smells could shield them from poisonous air. Others wore religious symbols, convinced divine protection was their only hope. Wealthy citizens often purchased expensive medicines made from rare ingredients imported from distant lands. These remedies promised safety, but few delivered results. In many cases, the treatments themselves caused additional suffering. Bloodletting remained common, with doctors removing blood from already weakened patients in hopes of restoring balance to the body. Various ointments were applied to plague swellings. Strange mixtures containing exotic substances were swallowed despite offering little benefit. Meanwhile, religious responses became increasingly common. Many people viewed the plague as a sign of divine anger. Churches filled with worshipers seeking forgiveness and protection. Public prayers, processions, and acts of penance became regular sights in many communities. Some individuals devoted themselves entirely to prayer, believing faith alone could save them. Yet despite every effort, the disease continued spreading. Families watched treatments fail again and again. Hope appeared briefly with each new remedy, only to vanish when more people fell ill. This cycle of hope and disappointment became one of the most painful aspects of the pandemic. People desperately wanted to believe that a cure existed somewhere. They wanted reassurance that the nightmare would soon end. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a world where uncertainty ruled every decision. As doctors searched for answers and ordinary people clung to any possibility of survival, the Black Death continued its relentless advance across Europe. The invisible enemy remained undefeated, and the darkest days of the plague were still ahead. As the Black Death tightened its grip on Europe, many cities began to experience something far worse than disease alone. The plague did not simply kill people. It disrupted every part of society. The systems that kept cities functioning slowly began to break apart. At first, markets remained open and daily life continued as normally as possible. Merchants still sold goods, craftsmen still worked in their shops, and officials attempted to maintain order. But as more people fell ill, the situation rapidly changed. Workers disappeared. Shop owners died. Customers stopped visiting crowded places. Fear spread through the streets like a second plague. In many cities, residents became afraid to leave their homes. Streets that had once been crowded with traders, laborers, and travelers became unusually quiet. The sounds of daily life faded away. Some towns seemed almost abandoned. Windows remained shut. Doors stayed locked. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. Those who were wealthy often attempted to flee. Noble families packed their belongings and escaped to country estates, hoping distance would protect them from infection. Some merchants abandoned businesses they had spent years building. Government officials occasionally fled as well. Yet many discovered that the plague followed wherever people traveled. The countryside offered no guarantee of safety. Meanwhile, those who remained behind faced growing challenges. Food became harder to obtain. Supply chains collapsed. Farmers died before harvests could be completed. Transport workers vanished. Essential goods became scarce in some regions. Prices fluctuated wildly. Families worried not only about disease but also about survival. Law and order became increasingly difficult to maintain. In certain cities, fear overwhelmed normal social behavior. Some people refused to care for sick relatives. Others abandoned infected family members in desperate attempts to protect themselves. Trust began to disappear. Neighbors viewed each other with suspicion. Travelers were treated as potential threats. Every stranger became a possible carrier of death. The psychological impact was enormous. Many people felt trapped inside a nightmare that never seemed to end. Every morning brought news of more deaths. Every evening brought uncertainty about who might fall ill next. Entire communities lived beneath a constant shadow of fear. For countless medieval Europeans, it felt as though the world itself was collapsing around them. The familiar order they had always known was disappearing, replaced by confusion, grief, and chaos on a scale few could have imagined. As the months passed, death became such a common part of life that many people struggled to remember what normal life had once felt like. In some cities, the number of victims grew so large that traditional funeral practices became impossible to maintain. Churches could no longer keep pace with the demand for burial services. Graveyards expanded rapidly, yet even these expansions often proved insufficient. Workers dug graves from dawn until nightfall, only to find that more bodies awaited them the following morning. Funeral bells rang so frequently that they became part of the background noise of everyday life. People who once paused to mourn each ringing bell eventually grew numb to the sound. It was simply too common. Entire families disappeared within days. A house that had been full of life one week could stand empty the next. Children lost parents. Parents lost children. Husbands lost wives. Wives lost husbands. Grief touched nearly every household. Some survivors described walking through streets where multiple homes displayed signs of sickness. The smell of illness and death lingered in the air. Fear mixed with exhaustion. People were no longer shocked by tragedy because tragedy surrounded them constantly. In certain regions, there were not enough healthy individuals left to perform all the necessary work. Fields remained unattended. Businesses closed permanently. Construction projects stopped. Communities that had taken generations to build suddenly found themselves struggling to function. Yet amid the darkness, small acts of courage continued to appear. Some doctors remained at their posts despite knowing the risks. Some priests continued comforting the dying. Some neighbors cared for the sick even when doing so endangered their own lives. These acts of compassion stood out because they occurred in a world increasingly dominated by fear. Nevertheless, the scale of the disaster remained overwhelming. Historians estimate that tens of millions of people died during the Black Death. In some areas, entire communities lost a third, half, or even more of their population. Such losses were almost impossible for medieval people to comprehend. The plague was no longer simply a disease. It had become a force that reshaped society itself. By the time the worst waves passed, Europe had been fundamentally changed. The cities that survived would never be quite the same. The people who lived through the Black Death carried its memories for the rest of their lives, remembering a time when death seemed to walk openly through the streets and when every sunrise felt uncertain. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, a terrible problem emerged in city after city. There were simply too many dead. In ordinary times, funerals were important events. Families gathered to mourn. Priests performed ceremonies. Loved ones were buried with care and dignity. But the plague shattered these traditions. The number of deaths became so overwhelming that many communities could no longer keep up. Gravediggers found themselves facing a task unlike anything seen before. Every morning brought new bodies. Every afternoon brought more. Every evening ended with the knowledge that even more would arrive tomorrow. What had once been a difficult profession became one of the most dangerous jobs in Europe. These men worked among the sick and the dead every day. They handled bodies, entered infected homes, and spent countless hours in graveyards that seemed to grow larger by the week. Many gravediggers eventually became victims themselves. Yet others continued working because somebody had to perform the task. Without them, cities would have descended into even greater chaos. In some places, traditional graves were no longer enough. Large burial pits began appearing outside city walls. Workers dug enormous trenches into the earth. Bodies were placed inside layer upon layer. Sometimes prayers were spoken. Sometimes there was not enough time. The scale of death had become too great. Families who once expected proper farewells often found themselves unable to provide them. Many never even saw where their loved ones were buried. For medieval people, this was deeply painful. Religious customs surrounding death were extremely important. The idea of losing those traditions added another layer of sorrow to an already devastating tragedy. Throughout Europe, stories spread of carts moving through the streets collecting victims. Church bells continued ringing. Graveyards expanded. New burial pits appeared wherever space could be found. The Black Death was transforming not only how people lived, but also how they died. Every fresh grave served as a reminder that the plague remained undefeated. Every burial pit revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. And every gravedigger who continued his work became an unwilling witness to one of the darkest chapters in human history. For those who survived the plague, one of the most disturbing experiences was becoming accustomed to death. At the beginning of the outbreak, every funeral felt shocking. Every loss felt impossible to accept. But as weeks turned into months, many communities entered a strange and tragic state where death became part of everyday life. People woke up expecting bad news. They went to sleep wondering who might be gone by morning. Entire neighborhoods lived beneath a constant cloud of uncertainty. In some cities, survivors reported seeing abandoned houses standing silently beside occupied ones. Doors remained shut. Windows stayed dark. Families had vanished without warning. Sometimes neighbors knew what had happened. Sometimes nobody knew at all. The plague erased lives with frightening speed. The psychological toll was enormous. Parents feared for their children every day. Children feared losing their parents. Friends hesitated before visiting one another. Even simple human interactions became sources of anxiety. A handshake, a conversation, or a shared meal could suddenly feel dangerous. Many people found themselves trapped between fear and loneliness. They wanted companionship, yet they feared infection. They wanted to help others, yet they feared becoming victims themselves. This conflict affected nearly every aspect of society. Some individuals became isolated. Others turned toward religion, hoping faith would provide comfort during uncertain times. Churches filled with people searching for answers. Prayers echoed through towns and villages across Europe. Yet despite these efforts, the plague continued claiming lives. Over time, survivors developed a grim resilience. They learned to continue living despite the constant presence of death. Markets reopened when possible. Farmers returned to fields. Craftsmen resumed their work. Human beings adapted because they had no other choice. But the emotional scars remained. Many would carry memories of the plague for the rest of their lives. They would remember the silent streets, the endless funerals, the burial pits, and the overwhelming fear that had gripped entire communities. They would remember a time when death seemed to be everywhere. And although the worst days of the Black Death would eventually pass, the memories of those dark years would linger for generations, shaping how people understood life, loss, and survival long after the plague itself had faded into history. As the Black Death continued to spread across Europe, many people searched desperately for an explanation. Medieval society was deeply religious. For most individuals, faith shaped how they understood the world. When crops failed, when storms destroyed homes, or when war erupted, people often looked to God for answers. The arrival of the plague was no different. In fact, because the disaster seemed so enormous and so difficult to understand, many believed it could only have a divine cause. Across Europe, countless people became convinced that the Black Death was a punishment for humanity's sins. Priests preached about repentance. Churches filled with frightened worshippers seeking forgiveness. Public prayers became common. Men, women, and children gathered together asking for mercy and protection. Some communities organized large religious processions through city streets. Participants carried crosses, sang hymns, and prayed that God would remove the plague from their towns. Yet, despite these displays of faith, the disease continued spreading. Every day brought new deaths. Every week brought fresh tragedies. This created a painful conflict in the minds of many believers. They prayed sincerely. They attended church. They confessed their sins. Yet friends and family members continued dying. Some people responded by becoming even more devoted. Others began questioning why such suffering was being allowed to continue. Fear fueled countless rumors. Strange stories spread from village to village. Some claimed certain groups were responsible for poisoning wells. Others believed mysterious forces were spreading disease through the air. Without scientific explanations, people often turned to superstition and speculation. Fear made even unlikely stories seem believable. The plague created an environment where uncertainty ruled every aspect of life. Nobody knew who would become sick next. Nobody knew when the outbreak might end. Under such conditions, people desperately searched for anything that offered comfort or meaning. Religious leaders attempted to provide guidance, but even they often lacked answers. Many priests died while caring for the sick. Monasteries suffered losses. Churches lost experienced leaders. Yet despite these hardships, faith remained a source of strength for countless survivors. In a world filled with death and uncertainty, belief offered hope that suffering was not meaningless. It offered comfort when explanations could not be found. And for many medieval Europeans, that comfort became one of the few things helping them endure the darkest years of the Black Death. The Black Death did more than kill millions of people. It changed how many survivors viewed life itself. Before the plague, most people expected the future to resemble the past. Communities followed familiar traditions. Families lived according to routines that had existed for generations. The world felt stable even if life was difficult. The plague shattered that sense of certainty. Suddenly, nothing seemed guaranteed. Healthy people died without warning. Prosperous families disappeared. Entire villages were transformed within a matter of months. The realization that life could change so quickly affected people deeply. Many survivors became more aware of how fragile existence truly was. They had watched neighbors vanish. They had buried friends and relatives. They had seen entire communities struggle to survive. Such experiences left lasting emotional scars. For some, the plague strengthened religious faith. Surviving such a catastrophe felt miraculous. They believed God had protected them and their loved ones. For others, however, the experience raised difficult questions. Why had so many innocent people suffered? Why had prayers seemingly gone unanswered? These questions did not always have clear solutions. Across Europe, people began rethinking old assumptions about life, death, and society. The labor shortages created by the plague changed economies. Survivors sometimes found new opportunities because so many workers had died. Entire social structures began shifting. In some regions, peasants gained greater bargaining power. Landowners struggled to replace lost workers. The balance of society slowly started changing. Yet beyond economics and politics, the emotional impact remained profound. Survivors carried memories of the plague for the rest of their lives. They remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the funerals, and the empty streets. They remembered living through a time when death seemed present everywhere. Even years later, stories of the Black Death continued to circulate. Parents told children about the terrible years. Communities remembered those who had been lost. The plague became part of collective memory. It was no longer simply an outbreak of disease. It had become a defining event that shaped generations. By the time the worst waves finally began to fade, Europe was not the same continent it had been before. The Black Death had altered populations, economies, institutions, and beliefs. It had changed how people thought about life, faith, and survival. And although the disease would eventually retreat, its shadow would remain over Europe for centuries to come. As the Black Death continued to devastate Europe, countless people came to the same desperate conclusion. If they stayed where they were, they might die. Fear drove many to abandon their homes, businesses, and even family members in search of safety. Wealthy merchants packed their belongings and fled crowded cities. Noble families retreated to distant estates in the countryside. Travelers filled roads that had once been used primarily for trade. Everywhere, people hoped distance might save them from the plague. The logic seemed simple. If disease was spreading through cities, then leaving the city should reduce the danger. Unfortunately, reality proved far more complicated. The plague traveled wherever people traveled. A merchant escaping an infected town could unknowingly carry the disease to a previously untouched village. A family seeking refuge in the countryside might bring sickness with them. Communities soon became suspicious of strangers. Villages closed gates and refused entry to travelers. Guards watched roads more carefully than before. Visitors who once would have been welcomed were now viewed as potential threats. Fear transformed hospitality into distrust. Many who fled discovered that escaping the plague was not easy. Food became difficult to find on the road. Inns closed their doors. Some travelers slept outdoors for weeks at a time. Others wandered from town to town only to be turned away repeatedly. Families became separated. Children were lost. Entire groups found themselves trapped between infected cities and fearful villages. Yet despite these hardships, people continued searching for safety because remaining behind often seemed even more dangerous. Stories spread of communities that had avoided outbreaks by isolating themselves. Whether true or not, such stories inspired hope. And in a world dominated by fear and uncertainty, hope was an incredibly powerful force. Every traveler believed that somewhere beyond the next hill or across the next river, safety might finally be waiting. But for many, the plague was already closer than they realized. No matter how far they ran, they could not outrun a disease that had spread across an entire continent. While millions perished during the Black Death, millions also survived. For those who lived through the pandemic, survival often felt mysterious. Why did one family lose everyone while another escaped with only a few illnesses? Why did one village suffer devastating losses while a neighboring settlement survived relatively intact? Medieval people had no answers to these questions. To them, survival often seemed like a matter of luck, fate, or divine intervention. Survivors watched friends disappear. They attended funeral after funeral. They expected death to arrive at their own door. Yet somehow they remained alive. This experience left a profound mark on many people. Some felt grateful. Others felt guilty. Many wondered why they had been spared when so many others had not. As the worst waves of the plague began to fade, survivors emerged into a world that looked very different from the one they had known before. Entire neighborhoods stood partially empty. Fields lay abandoned. Businesses had vanished. Families had been reduced to only a handful of members. The silence left behind by the dead could be almost as unsettling as the chaos that had come before it. Yet human beings are remarkably resilient. Slowly, life began returning. Markets reopened. Children played in the streets again. Farmers returned to their fields. Churches continued holding services. The process was gradual, but it was undeniable. Society had been wounded, yet it had not been destroyed. Survivors began rebuilding their communities piece by piece. New friendships formed. New families were created. New opportunities appeared in a world transformed by loss. For many, the experience changed their outlook forever. They had witnessed one of the deadliest disasters in history and endured it. They understood how fragile life could be. They understood how quickly ordinary routines could disappear. And because of that understanding, many viewed the future differently than previous generations had. The Black Death had taken millions of lives, but it had also revealed something about those who remained. Despite unimaginable suffering, despite fear, grief, and uncertainty, people continued moving forward. They rebuilt, they adapted, they survived. And in doing so, they helped shape the new Europe that would emerge from the shadow of the plague. By the time the worst waves of the Black Death finally began to fade, Europe was no longer the same continent it had been before. The plague had killed millions of people, and its effects could be seen everywhere. Entire villages had vanished from maps. Some homes stood empty for years. Fields that had once produced food for growing populations were now overgrown with weeds. Roads that had been busy with merchants and travelers became quieter. For survivors, the world felt strangely unfamiliar. They walked through places filled with memories of people who were no longer there. Every town seemed to have stories of loss. Every family carried scars from the disaster. Yet amid the devastation, unexpected changes began to emerge. Because so many workers had died, labor suddenly became far more valuable. Before the plague, peasants often had little power. There were many workers and few opportunities. Landowners could easily replace those who left. After the plague, however, the situation changed dramatically. Farms still needed workers. Workshops still needed craftsmen. Towns still needed builders. But there were far fewer people available to perform these jobs. Survivors suddenly found themselves in demand. Many workers began asking for higher wages. Some left old employers in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Landowners struggled to maintain large estates with reduced populations. The balance of power slowly began shifting. For the first time in generations, ordinary people gained leverage they had never possessed before. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it occur equally across every region. Yet the effects were undeniable. The Black Death had altered the economic foundations of medieval society. A disaster that had brought unimaginable suffering was also creating opportunities for some of those who remained. Historians often describe the plague as a turning point because it forced societies to adapt. Old systems no longer worked as they once had. Communities needed new solutions. Governments introduced laws attempting to control wages and labor. Employers competed for workers. Social mobility increased in some areas. Life remained difficult, but it was changing. Survivors were helping create a different future without fully realizing it. The plague had taken so much from them, yet it had also reshaped the world around them in ways that would continue influencing Europe for centuries. Years after the worst outbreaks ended, people still spoke about the Black Death with a mixture of fear, sorrow, and disbelief. Those who had lived through the pandemic often found it difficult to explain the experience to younger generations. How could someone describe a world where entire streets became silent? How could they explain the constant fear of illness, the endless funerals, and the uncertainty that had haunted every day? Many survivors carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Some remembered the first rumors arriving from distant lands. Others remembered watching neighbors fall ill. Many remembered the sound of church bells ringing almost without pause. These memories became part of family histories, passed down through stories and warnings. Children grew up hearing about the terrible years when death seemed to be everywhere. The Black Death became more than a historical event. It became a shared memory that shaped how people understood the world. Art, literature, religion, and culture all reflected its influence. Images of death became more common. Writers explored themes of mortality and uncertainty. Religious beliefs evolved as communities struggled to make sense of what had happened. The plague forced people to confront difficult questions about life and survival. Why had some lived while others died? Why had entire communities suffered? Why had the disaster been allowed to happen at all? There were no simple answers. Yet despite these questions, life continued. New generations were born. Towns recovered. Trade resumed. Kingdoms grew stronger. Human beings demonstrated an extraordinary ability to rebuild after catastrophe. This resilience became one of the most remarkable legacies of the Black Death. The pandemic had revealed the fragility of society, but it had also revealed its strength. Survivors refused to surrender to despair. They planted new crops, reopened businesses, rebuilt homes, raised families. They transformed tragedy into recovery, even while carrying painful memories of the past. Looking back across the centuries, the Black Death remains one of the deadliest events in human history. It changed economies, governments, religions, and cultures. It altered the course of nations. Yet perhaps its most enduring lesson lies in the story of those who survived. Faced with fear on a scale few generations have ever experienced, they continued moving forward. They endured. They adapted. And through their determination, a wounded continent slowly found its way back to life. Eventually, after years of fear, death, and uncertainty, something remarkable began to happen. The Black Death started to lose its grip. Not everywhere at once, and not suddenly, but gradually. In some towns, fewer people became sick. In others, the number of funerals slowly decreased. The church bells that had rung constantly for years began to fall silent more often. For the first time in a long time, people dared to hope. Yet hope came cautiously. The plague had taught Europe a painful lesson. Every time people believed the worst was over, another outbreak seemed to appear somewhere else. Entire generations had learned not to trust good news too quickly. Many survivors continued living with fear long after infection rates declined. They had seen too much suffering to simply return to normal. Every unusual fever still caused anxiety. Every rumor of illness attracted attention. The memory of the plague lingered in people's minds like a shadow that refused to disappear. Nevertheless, daily life slowly began rebuilding itself. Markets became busier. Farms returned to production. Travelers once again moved between cities. Children born after the worst outbreaks grew up in a world that was recovering. They heard stories from parents and grandparents about the terrible years when death had seemed unstoppable. To these younger generations, the plague often sounded almost unbelievable. How could entire cities have suffered so much? How could so many lives have been lost in such a short period of time? Yet for those who had survived, the memories remained vivid. They remembered the empty streets. They remembered abandoned homes. They remembered friends and family members who never returned. Recovery did not erase those memories. It simply allowed people to continue living despite them. Across Europe, communities worked to rebuild what had been lost. New homes were constructed. New businesses opened. New families formed. Life, as it always does, continued moving forward. But beneath the surface of this recovery was a profound understanding shared by an entire generation. They knew how quickly everything could change. They knew how fragile human life truly was. And because of that knowledge, they viewed the world differently than the generations that had come before them. The Black Death was ending, but its lessons would remain for centuries. Long after the worst years had passed, the Black Death remained alive in memory. Survivors told stories around fireplaces during cold winter evenings. Monks recorded events in manuscripts. Priests spoke about the plague in sermons. Parents warned children about the dangers they had witnessed. The pandemic became known as the Great Mortality, a disaster so enormous that people struggled to compare it to anything else in history. Entire regions had been transformed. Some villages never recovered. Others recovered slowly over generations. Graveyards expanded. Memorials were built. Local legends emerged. Every community had its own stories of loss and survival. In some places, people remembered brave doctors who had continued helping the sick despite great personal risk. In others, they remembered priests who comforted the dying. Some remembered neighbors whose kindness had saved lives during the darkest days. These stories became part of local identity. They helped communities make sense of what had happened. Yet memory was not always comforting. For many survivors, remembering also meant reliving painful experiences. The sight of certain streets, buildings, or churches could bring back memories of loved ones who had died. Anniversaries of outbreaks sometimes revived old fears. The emotional wounds left by the plague often lasted a lifetime. Historians today estimate that the Black Death killed tens of millions of people. Some regions lost a third, half, or even more of their populations. Such numbers are difficult to imagine. Behind every statistic was a human life. A parent, a child, a friend, a neighbor, a person with hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. This is what made the plague so devastating. It was not merely a historical event. It was a human tragedy on an enormous scale. Yet despite the suffering, the story of the Black Death is also a story of survival. Europe endured. Communities rebuilt. Families carried on. New generations inherited a world shaped by the pandemic, but they also inherited the resilience of those who had lived through it. The plague changed history forever, yet it did not end history. Humanity continued forward. And as the centuries passed, the memory of the Black Death remained a powerful reminder of both the vulnerability and the strength of human societies. It was a reminder that even during the darkest chapters of history, people continue to hope, endure, and rebuild. As the years passed and the Black Death slowly retreated into history, Europe found itself standing in a world that felt both familiar and completely different. The churches were still there. The castles still stood upon their hills. The fields still stretched across the countryside. Yet something had changed deep within society itself. The plague had left scars that could not be seen from a distance. Entire generations had lived through unimaginable suffering. Children had grown up watching funeral processions pass their homes almost every day. Adults had buried parents, spouses, siblings, and friends. Communities had watched their populations shrink before their eyes. For those who survived, the world after the plague often felt strangely empty. Many people spent years encountering reminders of those who were gone. An empty chair at a family table. An abandoned workshop that once belonged to a skilled craftsman. A farmhouse where laughter had once echoed through the halls. Everywhere there were memories. Yet despite the sadness, life continued moving forward. New children were born. New businesses appeared. New villages expanded. Nature slowly reclaimed abandoned land. Fields once left untouched during the worst years of the plague gradually returned to cultivation. Travelers once again filled roads connecting towns and cities. Markets became busy. Trade recovered. Europe was healing even if the process took decades. The survivors carried with them lessons that previous generations had never been forced to learn. They understood how quickly certainty could disappear. They understood how fragile human life truly was. Most importantly, they understood that even the strongest societies could be brought to their knees by forces they did not fully understand. This realization influenced how people thought about medicine, religion, government, and the future itself. In some regions, labor shortages transformed the economy. Workers became more valuable. Opportunities appeared where none had existed before. Families who survived sometimes inherited land, property, or businesses from relatives who had died. The structure of society began shifting in ways that would influence Europe for centuries. Historians often describe the Black Death as one of the great turning points of the medieval world. Not simply because of the deaths it caused, but because of the changes it set into motion. The plague forced societies to adapt. Old systems weakened. New ideas emerged. The Europe that entered the plague was not the same Europe that emerged from it. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred within the people themselves. Survivors developed a deeper awareness of mortality. They had seen firsthand how quickly life could change. They knew tomorrow was never guaranteed. Some became more religious. Others focused more intensely on family and community. Many simply learned to appreciate ordinary moments that previous generations may have taken for granted. Peaceful evening, a healthy child, a successful harvest. Small blessings suddenly felt more valuable after years of fear and loss. The plague had revealed the fragility of life, but it had also revealed the resilience of humanity. Again and again, people found ways to continue. They rebuilt homes, repaired churches, reopened businesses, planted crops, raised families. They refused to allow tragedy to define the future completely. And in doing so, they created the foundations of a new era. The shadow of the Black Death remained, but beyond that shadow stood a world determined to move forward. Now, as our journey through the age of the Black Death comes to an end, it is worth returning to the question that has quietly followed us from the very beginning. Would you have survived? It is a simple question, yet one with no easy answer. Survival during the Black Death often depended upon factors completely beyond a person's control. Some people lived in isolated villages that escaped major outbreaks. Others happened to avoid infection through sheer luck. Many who followed every precaution still became sick. Others who ignored every warning somehow remained healthy. The plague cared little about wealth, intelligence, courage, or kindness. Kings died, priests died, merchants died, farmers died, children died, entire families disappeared. In many cases, survival came down to chance. If you had lived in medieval Europe during those terrifying years, your fate might have depended on where you lived, who you met, which roads you traveled, or whether an infected flea happened to find you at the wrong moment. That uncertainty was one of the most frightening aspects of the Black Death. People could not see the enemy they were fighting. They could not fully understand how it spread. They lived in a world without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without scientific knowledge capable of explaining what was happening around them. Every morning brought uncertainty. Every sunset brought new fears. Yet despite all of this, millions survived. They endured the funerals, the fear, the empty streets, and the endless rumors. They witnessed suffering on a scale few generations have ever experienced. And somehow they continued moving forward. Their survival is one of the reasons we know this story today, because they rebuilt their communities. They preserved records. They passed stories to their children. They carried memories of the plague into the future. Through them, the lessons of the Black Death survived long after the disease itself faded. Looking back across nearly 7 centuries, the Black Death remains one of humanity's most powerful reminders of both vulnerability and resilience. It shows us how quickly the world can change. It shows us how fragile societies can be. But it also shows us something equally important. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to endure hardship. Even during the darkest moments, people continue helping one another. They continue hoping. They continue rebuilding. The Black Death was one of the greatest disasters in human history, yet it was not the end of the story. Life continued. Civilization continued. Humanity continued. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Tonight, as the medieval world fades into the distance and the final church bells grow silent, imagine standing on a quiet hill overlooking a European town many years after the plague has passed. The streets are busy once again. Children laugh in the marketplace. Farmers return from the fields. Merchants unload goods from distant lands. The scars of the past remain, but so does life. The sun slowly sets beyond the horizon. Evening settles over the rooftops. A church bell rings softly in the distance, not as a warning, not as a funeral toll, simply as part of another ordinary day. And after everything that happened, after all the fear, grief, and uncertainty, that ordinary day is perhaps the greatest victory of all. As the people below continue their lives, unaware that centuries later their story will still be remembered, the world grows quiet. The plague is gone. The survivors remain. History moves forward. And our journey through the age of the Black Death finally comes to an end. Sleep well.